The body disappears, even in Christian eschatology, as an earthly body forever. But its scattered chemicals are reutilized, according to some, to clothe the soul in heavenly places, or for purposes of torture and indescribable anguish. Others have sought consolation in the thought of the reappearance of the body's elements in various beautiful forms, in the ruby goblet, in the flowers, in the foam of the sea. And this reviving herb, whose tender green hedges the river lip on which we lean. Lean upon it lightly. For who knows from what once lovely lip it springs unseen. Of those believing in the separateness of the soul there may be many who fondly crave that the gentle dews of eternal sleep may fall at last upon its suppliant eyes. He giveth his beloved sleep. A writer in the Monist of January, 1898, makes the following remarks in a reference to self. In the psychological theories of Christianity and Buddhism there is more agreement than at first sight appears, for it is difficult to say what we must understand by self. Personality is used by Christian thinkers in a very loose sense. In the doctrine of the Trinity it is not incompatible to speak of three personalities in one. He quotes texts from St. Paul's epistles to the Corinthians. I have planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. So, then, neither is he that planteth anything, neither he that watereth, but God that giveth the increase. Now, he that planteth and he that watereth are one. In this connection the writer observes. Here, apparently, everyone is supposed to have no separate existence whatever, except in God and through God. The self, soul, or individuality, which continues after the dissolution of the body, has been broadly described as character or disposition. Therefore, in using the term self in a Buddhistic sense, we must put aside every idea beyond what is conveyed to the mind by this interpretation. This character or disposition does not come to an end as an activity until tanha, or the thirst to live for living's sake, is extinct. Therefore, when Buddhistic thought is converted into conventional language, we must be cautious how we interpret such a statement as we are saved by our individual merits. The we here means only character, which, if improved during a lifetime, carries with it this improvement, of which a new being will reap the benefits. Professor Rhys Davids calls the mystery of karma a desperate expedient, a wonderful hypothesis, an airy nothing, an imaginary cause beyond the reach of reason. But he previously states that it affords an explanation quite complete, to those who can believe it, of the apparent anomalies and wrongs in the distribution here of happiness and woe. So it may be said, also, of the mysteries attaching to Christianity. They satisfy the believer, though they present difficulties to the reasoner. According to the Christian formula, we are, as Burton says, fallen beings, not through our own fault. Condemned to death, not through our own demerits. Ransomed by a divine being, not through our own merits. The Buddhist saying, from birth came death, and the story of the Garden of Eden, seem to possess some figurative connection with the transition of microorganisms from a falciparous to a duogenous condition. The amoeba is endowed with the potentialities of eternal life. But when the spermatozoid and ovule, the symbolic serpent and apple, appeared on the scene, when the luminous Adam passed successively through the falciparous and androgynous states, and finally became man and woman, death entered into the world. The writer in the Monist already referred to, commenting upon the text, every man shall receive his own reward according to his own labor. 1 Cor. I. 5 says. The coincidence of Buddhism and Christianity is remarkable in this passage. For, as the Buddhist scriptures speak of the fruits of karma, so Paul speaks of the rewards of one's labor. Mr. Lilly, in referring to the doctrine of reincarnation, quotes from an article in the Church Quarterly Review, in which, he says, the author of the article, in proof of the existence of this doctrine, adduces the question put by the disciples of Christ in reference to the man born blind. And if it was considered that a man could be born blind as a punishment for sin, then it must have been plainly committed before his birth. In the White Lotus of Dharma there is an account of the healing of a blind man. Because of the sinful conduct of the man, in a former birth, this malady has arisen. He also remarks that, in the case of the paralytic, Luke v. 18, the cure was effected, not by any physical processes, but by annulling the sins which were the cause of the malady. The Rev. Mr. Spence Hardy, in his Manual of Buddhism, observes that, no one can tell but a Buddha how karma operates or how the chain of existence commenced. It is as vain to ask in what part of the tree the fruit exists before the blossom is put forth as to ask for the locality of karma. When the king of Sagal inquired where karma resides, its locality, Nagasena replied, "Karma is like a shadow that always accompanies the body. But it cannot be said that it is here, or that it is there. In this place, or in that place. It has, I believe, been stated by some writers that it would have been as well if Gautama had not encumbered his teaching with such a complex and metaphysical theory as karma, and had confined himself to the admirable moral precepts which form the real backbone of his system. It has been thought, too, that in introducing karma into his scheme of things he was playing the role of an opportunist, because he felt it to be necessary for the success of his mission that it should not be altogether severed in outline from such a conception as that of metempsychosis, which was deeply implanted in the minds of the Brahmanic philosophers of those times. Buddhism would certainly have been incomplete if it had not included mysteries, as Christianity would not be Christianity without an admixture of the indefinable. Karma, as working, may, I think, be regarded as one of the essential components of Christian thought with regard to the soul. It is the working of the soul at the same time, the being made soul a disposition. As the latter it is heritable and appropriable. Its effects are endless, and this working is carried on, so to speak, from generation to generation, organically and inorganically, in the rock, in the flower, and in all animal life, the same producing the same, and yet not the same. The doctrine of karma is justifiably proclaimed as the most important tenet of Buddhism, for on it depends the whole system of morality and of individual responsibility. And yet, strange to say, there is no part of Buddhism which has occasioned so much controversy and difference of opinion. It is at once the foundation of belief for millions of true believers and the basis of skepticism on the part of many who would otherwise willingly concur in the dogmas of this religion. In this respect it holds an analogous position to that of the doctrine of the resurrection of the body in the judgment of Christianity. Is it possible, some ask, that a belief in the doctrine of karma, which has exercised so enormous an influence for good over countless millions of human creatures, many of them men of the highest order of culture and intellectuality, should only be resolvable into an airy nothing? We may have to acknowledge that the reason is not able to follow the idea of karma through all its phases, nor yet to assimilate the various postulates which it demands. But can Christianity boast of doctrines which are always reducible to the canons of reason and common sense? We think not. Here, again, we find a common ground between these two religions. Neither is capable of being wholly defended by matter-of-fact methods. Both demand a certain measure of faith from their adherents. The strength of the dogma of karma lies rather in the fact that, like the ideas of free will, heaven, and God, it is innate in a large portion of mankind. And it would be sheer presumption to dismiss with a few contemptuous phrases a belief which is deeply embedded in nearly one half of the human race. The seeming injustice of the unequal distribution of happiness and suffering among human beings is a problem which Christianity does not attempt to solve. Buddhism, on the other hand, grapples with the difficulty. And we have the much debated doctrine of karma as the result. There can be no doubt that this doctrine, once accepted, removes all difficulty out of the way. Karma is literally action, or doing. This action, after death, and during life too, bears fruit, for the consequences of action cannot be destroyed. It is, in fact, the scientific theory of the conservation of energy. When the individual dies, his karma effects are reincarnated, as it were, in another being, and form the connecting link between the two individuals, the one the author of the karma effects, the other the inheritor of them. In this particular way we have a sufficient explanation and justification of moral retribution. How this second individual comes into existence expressly for the purpose of inheriting the karma of the first, and the nature and mode of the transmigration of karma, are questions which have generally been placed beyond the scope of the human intellect, and will be considered later on. A way out of this difficulty has been proposed, by which, while still adhering to the essentials of the doctrine of karma, we can reduce it to a form more capable of being grasped and supported by our reason. But it has no authority among the utterances of Gautama, and, in accepting it, we should be diverging somewhat from orthodox Buddhism. Suppose we take as an analogy the case of a river, which, after flowing some hundreds of miles, is dried up by the heat of the sun. It is evident that the river, while flowing between its banks, has been absorbed in a great measure by the porous earth, and has gone to fructify the soil. The trees, grass, and crops which have been produced by its moisture are, of course, its karma, the effects of its action, or doing. When it has ceased to flow, the whole of its karma has been dissipated into various effects, which, in the turn becoming causes, exercise their influence over practically the whole earth. There is no karma, intact and integrated, which, according to some views of Buddhism, should be the raison d'être of another river. In the same way, an individual, while alive, scatters his karma, or the influence of his character, among his surroundings. When he has ceased to live, he has also ceased to act, and, consequently, there can be no more karma. This is one way of getting rid of the idea of a lump of karma, which after death, in some way or another, is supposed to produce, or to have produced, for it another body, into which it may carry the defects, virtues, vices, and follies of its originator. Another weakness which has been considered inseparable from the orthodox teaching of Buddhism is the fact that it seems to fail to account fully for the action of heredity. When two people have children, does it not appear right to think that the children should inherit the karma? But it is obviously impossible that this should be the case, except in the unlikely contingency of both parents dying exactly at the moment of the children's birth. And, again, why should a man's karma be embodied in an individual having no visible connection with his offspring? Or how can we reconcile the non-existence of selfhood as a permanent entity with the recognition of a more or less self-sufficient karma, which preserves its separateness not only through life, but after death, and into life again? These and other similar questions arise, and demand explanation from the bewildered brain. These questions, it has been contended, do not arise as difficulties impossible of solution, if we consider the analogy given above. The children of two people are obviously the karma, and they appropriate, so to speak, a very large proportion of the effects of their doing. As it is only just and reasonable that they should do. Innumerable actions on the part of the parents have led up to acquaintance and union, and the birth of the child is merely the climax of an endless chain of causes and effects. But this process of reasoning closely borders on the confines of metempsychosis, in the phraseology of which the doctrine of karma has often been mistakenly expounded. The doctrine of karma is a modification of metempsychosis, and, as such, certainly stands on a more scientific and rational basis than its prototype. In consequence of the intermixture of the two theories in the minds of exponents of karma, much misapprehension has arisen, and this doctrine continues to be a stumbling block to students of Buddhism. A considerable amount of confusion arises also, I think, from the fact that writers on Buddhism fail to discriminate between karma, the law of karma, and the effects of karma, although the word karma includes the two latter. It is a mistake to assume that karma, interpreted as thoughts, words, and actions, is perpetuated as such, for each thought, word, and action passes forever away while it happens. Each dies, yet each continues for all eternity in the effect it produces. The being of a past moment of thought has lived, but does not live, nor will it live. The being of a future moment of thought will live, but has not lived, nor does it live. The being of the present moment of thought will live, but has not lived, nor will it live. It cannot be held, therefore, if we read Buddhism aright, that karma in itself possesses continuity. The I of today has to take all the consequences of the actions karma, which the I of yesterday performed. Thus the individualized karma of future times will reap all that which the individualizing karma of the present time sows. A.F. Professor Rhys Davids Buddhism, p. 103, says, identity is preserved in that which alone remains when a man dies. In the result, namely, of his action, speech, and thought, in his good or evil karma, literally his doing, which does not die. This statement would have gained in clearness if he had written, in the result of his good or evil karma which does not die. In the concluding sentence, if we allow ourselves to consider karma, taken in the sense of doing, as retaining a separateness apart from its diffusion of influences, and being carried on from generation to generation as an individualized compound, then we at once find ourselves in direct conflict with the doctrine of inseparateness, which is the mainstay of the rationality of Buddhist thought, the basic concept of Buddhism. If we understand by the samskaras that phase of a man's soul which is impressed upon other generations by heredity and education, and that which is preserved by the law of karma and conditions the continuity of man's existence in a whirl of constant changes, it must be exclusively in the sense that these samskaras are formative faculties peculiar to, and always to be found, in normal cases, in interconnection with those temporary aggregations which present themselves to our perceptions as human beings, but which are not permanent. It is only when the expressions karma and action are used in the widest meaning, and include this formative faculty, that they can with propriety be regarded as possessing continuity, but not permanency. The particular formative faculty ceases to be, in those exceptional cases when it directs itself to the cessation of all confirmations. This self-forming formative faculty, in its normal condition, is the cause of the continuity of being, or becoming. Its disappearance is happiness. We find this Buddhistic truth very clearly stated in the New Testament. He who loses his life shall find it. Which, being interpreted, is, he who loses the formative faculty shall find the deathless. Karma, as thought, speech, and action, must be regarded as the ethical individuality, and the body as the corporeal individuality. As things in themselves they are both impermanent, but the effects of both are lasting. There are physiological and local as well as psychological results to be taken into account. The body is continually shedding effects, and lives again after death in its diffused elements. So karma gives off effects and lives again in its moral results. Yet both these individualities are inseparably connected as long as the individual's life lasts. The text so often quoted in this connection should, for purposes of Buddhistic exposition, read, "What a man sows, that will the race, not he, reap." Herein is that saying true, one soweth and another reapeth. John IV. 37. Man weaves and is clothed with derision. Sows, but shall not reap. His life is a watch and a vision. Between asleep and asleep. What has been called physical or local karma is applied to the effects of locality and climate upon the development of races and individuals. A writer in the Journal of the Maha Bodhi Society, November, 1898, AG, says, "The theory of karma, as Gautama formulated it, is all-embracing and comprehensive. It ranges over the whole field of life and morality. It ascribes causes for things, explains the working of the complicated machinery of the cosmos, abolishes the unwholesome idea of universal chaos and absence of motive power, substitutes in its place a definite and well-arranged system admirably suited to the needs of mankind, and finally establishes firmly the supreme importance of individual morality and responsibility. What more can one desire?" "All very well," the skeptic replies. It may perform all you say it does, but I must be able to grasp it thoroughly and work it out in my own mind. I will take nothing for granted. I must be able to follow, to understand it, and harmonize it with facts of which I have certain knowledge. None of your vague insinuations for me. I reply. How can you with your limited and finite empirical knowledge fully understand that which is limitless and infinite? The doctrine of karma embraces all the greatest problems of life and the cosmos. And how can you, a mere atom in the universe, expect to grasp the whole? It is sufficient that you should have a working theory which fulfills your requirements, and is at the same time sanctioned by your reasoning power. More you cannot expect to have. The doctrine of karma, in short, marches step by step with our reason. At no point does it break away from the laws of common sense. The difficulty lies in the fact that, while our reasoning at a certain point comes to a halt through lack of further material, the doctrine of karma perseveres onwards into the spheres of higher knowledge whither our limited brain capacity cannot follow. There are two methods by which the doctrine of karma may be explained, viz., by individualization and by generalization. The former is the more orthodox and popular, the latter more sound and philosophical. But, although we find in the recorded sayings of Gautama support of the former and little or none of the latter, I think we may infer that his attitude was due to the exigencies of the conditions under which he lived and the ignorance of the masses who surrounded him. For the same reason Christ was forced to clothe his teachings in simple and primitive guise in order that they might be readily grasped by the popular mind. As an outcome of this necessity, we have the parables of the New Testament and much of the veiled language therein contained. To these are due in large measure the controversies and differences of opinion which now exist as to the proper interpretation of the words of Christ. The significance of many of Buddha's utterances has been similarly degraded. Countless birth stories have sprung up to satisfy the popular craving for something concrete and simple in which to believe. The themes have no real authority in Buddhistic teaching, but they serve the same purpose as do the Christian parables and myths. The student of Buddhism who stumbles upon them by chance may be led into false notions with regard to the religion, and accept as authoritative that which has no real authority. Herein lies the harm. That they are not strictly in accordance with Gautama's teachings there can be no doubt. The theory of soul transmigration upon which these tales are chiefly founded is an excrescence on Buddhism, and should be regarded in the light of a heresy. As Professor Rhys Davids observes, Buddhism does not teach the transmigration of souls. Its doctrine would be better summarized as the transmigration of character. Professor Oldenburg puts with much clearness the teaching of the action of transmigration and karma when he says, Buddhism teaches, my action is my possession, my action is my inheritance, my action is the womb which bears me, my action is the race to which I am akin. What appears to man to be his body is in truth the action of his past state, which, assuming a form realized through his endeavors, has become endowed with a tangible existence. The same idea is expressed in a slightly different form by Dr. Paul Carus, who says, we ourselves continue in the accumulated results of our actions. In these concise and seemingly simple statements we have the fundamental dogma of Buddhism and the foundation of Gautama's system as it has been handed down to us. When we come to analyze them carefully, the difficulties which at first lie hidden become apparent. We see that a man during his lifetime scatters the effects of his actions, i.e., his karma, in all directions. Upon his death a new sentient being, realized through his endeavor, comes into existence to inherit and carry on his karma. These two beings are not connected in any way the one with the other. There has been no transmigration of soul or of the ego, for Buddhism denies the existence of either as a permanent entity, but describes them as temporary aggregations only. How, then, does moral retribution act? Or how can we reconcile the non-existence of self as a permanent entity with the recognition of the existence of a more or less integral and permanent karma which preserves its separateness, not only through life, but after death and into life again? How, too, is it possible that his karma, although scattered in all directions during his term of life, at the moment of death is intact and whole for transmission to another body? Moreover, it is obvious that, if the death of one human being is the cause of the birth of another, the human race would not progress numerically. The very fact of the numerical increase of mankind defeats this theory and renders it untenable by all those who desire to believe only what the reason sanctions, and to eschew whatever demands the acceptance of authority or the exercise of faith. In short, as Professor Rhys Davids has put it, the weakness of the Buddhistic conception is that, the result of what a man is, or does, is held not to be dissipated, but to be concentrated together in the formation of one new sentient being. By digressing somewhat from strict Buddhistic teaching, and leaving behind the letter, not the spirit, of the law, we can, I think, arrive at a more satisfactory explanation by a method I have called generalization, in contradistinction to the method just dealt with, viz., individualization. According to the orthodox conception, an individual takes up the karma of another while it is intact and has not suffered from distribution and dispersion. But there is a broader and less primitive, albeit more heterodox, manner in which we may regard the doctrine, and one which, I think, we may infer was in the mind of Gautama himself when he enunciated the narrower conception in order to simplify it sufficiently to be capable of being grasped by the ignorant. Instead of a man's karma being individualized, i.e., handed on in an integral state from individual to individual, we should regard it rather as having been generalized and disintegrated during life, leaving no residuum at death. Thus, what is inherited at birth is not the karma of any one person, but rather the karma of the race as a whole. The souls of men continue to exist as they are impressed upon other generations by heredity and education, but the soul of the individual does not continue to exist. It is the soul of the race, not of the individual, which is perpetuated. The karmas of all are, as it were, cast into the mixing pot and thoroughly sifted, and then, and not till then, embodied in different forms. Seeming inequality of division must be accounted for by the action of local karma. There is obviously an advantage associated with this theory not applicable to the theory of individualization. Whereas the latter tends to promote the fallacious idea of personality and selfhood, the former has a wider significance, and tends rather to promote the belief in universal brotherhood by merging personalities into one great whole. It is, in fact, more truly Buddhistic, and, by inspiring a more cosmopolitan sentiment of fellowship, is calculated to overcome, in a great degree, that fallacy most difficult of all fallacies to overcome, the idea of the ego as a permanent entity. The difficulty, also, which is universally felt of accounting for the birth of a new sentient being at every death is by this means obviated. Most assuredly we require an explanation of our present condition, and we must accord all honor to Buddhism for having afforded us one both rational and satisfactory. When men come to see and to realize that by every deed committed, and by every word uttered, they are carving out, for evil or good, the future of the race, and that the suffering they now endure they owe entirely to the past sins of humanity, the sense of responsibility will be increased, the hold upon morality strengthened, the bond of unity, the brotherhood of man, confirmed. Abolish the fallacy of cosmic chaos. Substitute in its stead the idea of a definite system and purpose. Show that man is the only framer of his destiny, the only author of his existence, the only cause of his own suffering, and the foundation of morality will be made sure, the redemption of the race brought within measurable distance. This is the end for which the doctrine of karma was formulated, and to this end it has been laboring, a silent but progressive force, for many centuries. The Rev. T. Sterling Berry, D.D., in his comparative study of Christianity and Buddhism, treats the latter as a whole in a spirit of commendable Catholicity. But when he comes to points of contrast, he fails signally to preserve equanimity of judgment, and distorts the import of Gautama's precepts in the most amazing fashion in his endeavor to bring them into opposition to the teaching of Jesus. His view of karma, however, is, I think, a valuable contribution to the literature on the subject, and worthy of reproduction. He writes, "Strange and well-nigh unintelligible as this theory seems, it is nevertheless possible, I believe, to get at the real thought that molded Gautama's conception, actions of every kind as possessing the nature of seed sown. Men were found, to some extent, to reap the consequences of their actions during the lifetime. But this takes place only in a limited and incomplete sense during the existence to which the actions belong. At the close of a life many acts remain like seed sown, but not yet grown up. Hence the theory that when a man dies he leaves the sum total of the acts of his life as a kind of complex seed, made up of good and bad elements, which, by his death, springs up into a fresh existence, the same and yet not the same. In somewhat of the sense in which it might be said that ordinary seed which springs up is identical and yet not identical with that which is sown. Viewed in this light, the theory loses its apparent absurdity. It becomes, in fact, a mode of expressing partly what we understand by the law of heredity, which involves a transference of character and a reproduction of the consequences of action, and partly the law of retribution, that whatsoever a man soweth that shall he also reap.